Okay, guys, so this is going to be a pretty quick little wrap up here. We just have a couple of things left to talk about before you can go on your merry way for the day. So, in terms of social cleavages in Mexico, one of the big ones, of course, is ethnic and national identity. To what degree do people identify as Mexican? To what degree do they identify as indigenous? And of what indigenous identity do they adhere? And all sorts of things there. And we talked a little bit about the Zapatistas, and you guys are going to do some further reading for me on that with regards to your next Flipgrid Harkness. So the other major social cleavages I want you to pay attention to actually kind of connect to these ideas. One of the big divisions here is urban versus rural communities. Under the PRI, Mexico was mostly rural for much of its history. I mean, if we think about the PRI emerging in the late 1920s, Mexico hadn't fully industrialized at that point. It really wasn't until after Cardenas that they had a full-scale industrial revolution. And so as a result, most people were campesinos. Most people were peasants. They lived in rural communities. They worked the land. They were either farmers, tenant farmers, or they worked on haciendas and were dealing with like ranches and things like that. And so as a result, the patron-client system was really, really powerful for the PRI because you had these populations that were dispersed, that had low levels of literacy, that had low access to outside information and all sorts of stuff like that. And that made them easy to control through patron-client relationships. But Mexico has changed massively. Today, Mexico is more than 75% urban. More than 75% of Mexicans live in large cities, not just DF, of course. They live in Ciudad Juarez. They live in, Veracruz. They live in a million different big cities, and as a result, like the promises that the PRI made don't necessarily apply to the people in urban communities. And so the overall sort of culture and values of people in Mexico have radically changed. And that's part of why you see so much political disorganization currently in Mexico is that like the what do people want? What does it mean to be Mexican has radically changed in a relatively short period of time. We have seen the literacy rate go up to about 90%. That rate is very high in cities, very low in the countryside. It is higher with men than it is with women. It's very similar to, say, like Nigeria with regards to that. We also see regional differences in Mexico. The north versus the south are massively different. In the north, close to the US border, the north tends to be more well off. They tend to do a lot more trade with the United States. There are a lot more maquiladores. We'll be talking about those shortly. And broadly, they're more industrialized. There's more middle class people, and there's a higher level of education. The South, on the other hand, has a much higher indigenous population. The further south you go, once you hit like Morelos and a little bit further south than that, the South is heavily indigenous still. You get into mountainous territories in Chiapas, and kind of alongside the border of Guatemala. And as a result, populations are more isolated, incomes are lower. There aren't as many factories, there aren't as many industrialized jobs, and so as a result, more people are involved still in agrarian pursuits. There are lower levels of education, and that has negative consequences as well with income disparity. And then we have social class. Mexico is a highly class-conscious society. Social class is really, really evident in Mexico. There's a high degree of economic inequality in Mexico. If you go to Mexico City, there are multiple different worlds that exist within that city. There are people who live lives very, very similar to what you would see anywhere in any large city around the world, in the United States, in Europe, where everything is pretty much developed first world. And then you have whole parts of the cities that's of the city that doesn't have access to clean drinking water. There is a growth of a middle class, but one thing to pay attention to is that that growing middle class is often very heavily dependent upon an informal economy. Now, that is not always we're not always just talking about like the cartels in Mexico. We'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. But sometimes this means that you've got people who are like street vendors, or people who cut hair or just have any number of small businesses, but they're not registered. They don't necessarily pay taxes, and they kind of work, off the books, under the table sort of stuff. But that is where you tend to see middle class growth actually in Mexico, because it's hard to start a business in Mexico. So if you watch any Mexican movies or telenovelas, or consume any Mexican media at all, you're very likely to find a lot of stories about class consciousness. People are really aware of it. It's kind of an unpleasant thing to talk about in Mexico, but it's also something that everybody is very aware of. I would say that out of the case studies we've really looked at, I would say that Mexico is only second to the United Kingdom in terms of people's awareness of the role of social class. I would say, however, that Mexico is much more willing to talk about it. If you watch any major movies that have kind of been up for awards recently in the sort of the American awards fairs, that are Mexican, particularly, oh gosh, the films of Alfonso Cuarón, like Roma, which is on Netflix, which I highly recommend. That is 100% about indigeneity and class, and you should watch it. And I'm going to stop there for the day. Your homework today, your where you are work, I guess, is going to be to start working on reading your Harkness readings, because you're going to need to have that done for me by Wednesday. Okay. And if you finish that early, get on Netflix and watch Roma. It is an hour, but I do recommend it. It's an excellent film. Have a good day.